George Cunningham had one more shot left, and although he could hardly be called middle class anymore, he took his shot. And in I believe the spring of 1850, he boarded a boat and went out to California to try one last thing to try to make some money. He failed out there. He lasted about 3 months, came home later in 1850, made the transit across the Isthmus of Panama, and arrived back in New York probably ill with a tropical disease. The couple moved into a very modest row house that still stands down near the entrance to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel on 4th Place, and I guess you call it Carroll Gardens now. And they lived a very modest lifestyle there. And then George died on June 1st, 1854, leaving poor Emma Hempstead Cunningham with 5 mouths to feed, a $10,000 life insurance policy proceeds, and about $6,000 in debts. And say what you want about inflation, $4,000 or $5,000 didn't buy you much of anything in 1854, and she was in deep, deep trouble. She also had been denied, her dreams had just been wiped out. She had gone on a curve. She was going to get where she wanted to go and thought she was entitled to go in 1846, 1847. But by 1854, she was headed down, and she had one thing to do. Women had no alternatives in those days. The jobs available to women, if you had the time, if somebody could take care of your kids, you could be a lace maker, you could be a type rubber, you could be a serving girl, you could make $1 a week, $2 a week. I mean, you were going to starve to death on this alone, much less support children. She was estranged from her birth family. The Hempsteads wanted nothing to do with her. She had married this Presbyterian distiller. Forget it. They're not going to help her, and they weren't even in a position to help her. So she was really up the creek and not really too eager to turn to a life of prostitution, which was the other alternative available to women in those days. And so she knew she had to find a new, wealthy husband, but quick, and South Brooklyn was hardly the place to go looking. Emma packed her bags. Can you hear me without this mic?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll get through the mic. Emma packed her bags in the middle of the summer of 1854, went down to the ferry dock with her 2 older daughters, 3 daughters and 2 sons, and they hied themselves over to Manhattan and moved into a series of boarding houses in the summer of 1854, first with a Dr. Longfellow and several other people, no permanent lodging, not much money. Somehow, and I can't prove this, but I do know for a fact that she took one of her older daughters to what was called a hydropathy clinic for some treatments, a water cure clinic. Water cure clinics were become very popular in this country as well as in Europe in the late 1840s and early 1850s. And I suspect that Emma met Dr. Harvey Burdell in one of these water cure doctors' clinics. These were clinics where people who had some aspirations to society or intelligentsia, et cetera, would go and get treated in these clinics. Harvey's older brother, John, had been a very, very close friend of some of the most prominent water cure practitioners in New York, who actually lived on Bond Street also at number 47, where the restaurant Il Buco is today. You can see another extant structure there. I think they met each other at this water cure clinic, and they began to become acquainted. Harvey Burdell was a very, very handsome man, if you ask me, and we'll put his picture up here. Really a fairly striking man, and known about town as a ladies' man. Emma herself was nothing to sneeze at, 33 years old in 1854. This was hardly the best shot of her, but when she smiled, she was really quite attractive, a buxom, trim, well-maintained woman, and they took a liking to each other. Harvey took a liking to her, not out of sexual interest particularly. He thought she had inherited a good bit of money from George Cunningham. People couldn't check each other out on the internet or whatever. There was no FASB accounting statements back then, and he thought she had money. And she knew he had money. He owned several houses on Bond Street. He had various investments. And what he wanted from her was that she should be other people's money for him. And he took her over to one of his real estate investments ventures over in Elizabeth, New Jersey. one day in June of 1855, thinking that he could entice her into investing in this scheme over there. And somehow they missed the last train back that night. It was just, just one of these accidents. So they had to stay at his hotel in Elizabeth. Well, it was funny up to a point until he forced himself on her that night. And predictable results occurred really quite rapidly. They came back to New York. She was pregnant. He was not happy about that. She wanted him to marry her. She'd found the guy she wanted. He had some money, and he was suave and debonair, and etc. And okay, when I say he forced himself on her, that's what she said when she sued him for breach of promise. I'll bet he did. I don't know. It wasn't so horrible that she didn't want to still be attached to him. That I'm sure of. Burdell was having nothing of this pregnancy and nothing of this marriage. And this desperate woman underwent an abortion produced upon her by his own hands that summer. Okay? She's not living with him yet. And they continue to see each other. And they actually go to Saratoga Springs in August of 1855. Saratoga Springs in those days was the East Hampton of New York. This is where widows, widowers, single people, regardless of their previous marriages, people with families, with eligible daughters, eligible men, everybody went to Saratoga. You could get there, since 1853, you could get there on the New York Central Railroad. You didn't have to be super wealthy to stay in Saratoga. And one of the places you stayed was at Haythorne's Congress Hall Hotel, long since burned down, but it sat next to Congress Spring in Saratoga, which is still there. And I spent several days up in Saratoga checking all of this out. One of the most marvelous things I found when you're doing archival research, you stumble on things. And I'm looking through this dusty old bunch of papers in the Skidmore College archives there in the library. And at Congress Hall, there were balls, there were dances on the weekends, every weekend during the summer. And I opened up this folder, and here is a dance card from Congress Hall Hotel from the season of 1855. There's a little, it's not a color shop, it's a little pink ribbon here, and I almost lost it. This is the dance card that Emma Cunningham and her daughter Helen wore around their wrist as they were whirled around the room, and the quadrille and the schottische, and they're not filled in. But this is the card that they wore. And there's so few things left of these people's lives. Their wills, their legal documents in courthouses, but there's nothing left of these people's lives other than their bones and their coffins and some documents. To find something like this, it really makes your day, to say the least. They slept with each other again in Congress Hall. They came back at the end of August. They came back perhaps on the New York Central. The train's chugging along. The bell is clanging. Emma is hearing wedding bells in her ears. All right, and but Harvey Burdell, he's hearing a different kind of ringing in his ears. She met his banker friends. She's not investing with him. And sure enough, as soon as she got back to New York, she started to feel queasy in the morning again. Okay, not a good situation. They continued to be in touch, and she actually moves into his home as a boarder with her 5 children of the then current landlady, Mrs. Jones. Come here and pay some rent. Well, you can move into the house, but stay out of my hair. There was a really crazy thing going on between them. She's quite pregnant. Harvey is meanwhile doing his own business. He's bringing all sorts of other women into the house, including his 21-year-old cousin, Dimas Hubbard, who is estranged from her whore-hopping husband, William Vorse, and Harvey gives her shelter. And in Dimas comes, except there's a certain quid pro quo for the shelter that's given his young cousin, right in front of Emma Cunningham's nose. And in fact, she undergoes another abortion around Thanksgiving time of 1855 in the home. And wow, to show you what a bastard this guy was, this Harvey Burdell, while Emma Cunningham is lying upstairs in a sickbed recovering from this abortion, Harvey trots in with some papers he wants her to sign. What are these papers? In the mid-19th century in this country, I think as well as in England, a woman who wanted to divorce her husband could not file court papers, could not file a complaint in her own name. She had to get a next friend to sign the papers to get divorced. And so, of course, Dimas asked her cousin Harvey Burdell to do this for her. But Harvey Burdell didn't like his name bandied about. So what does he do while his, at least by his version, his ex-lover is lying sick, bleeding upstairs, recovering from abortion? He takes Dimas's papers upstairs to Emma and says, "Would you please act as her next friend?" And she said yes. She signed those papers. I found them in a dirty old file down on the 7th floor of the Surrogates Court building in the old records division. She really did it. And none of this was known or reported in contemporary journalism. It's never been known until I dug it out now. And this is what kind of cad Harvey Burdell was. There's not time to tell you about all the fighting that went on, but on and on and on it went. It's the fall, it's the winter of 1855. And Emma brings suit finally for breach of promise. And Harvey's not marrying her. And he settles that suit with her in writing by agreeing to have her replace Mrs. Jones as the landlady, but just as the landlady, arm's length, and move her 5 kids into the house. And that takes place in May of 1856. Dimas, who has been living in the house since then, Dimas Hubbard Vorse, is thrown out. But she and Harvey continue to see each other on the sly, as well as a slew of other women who are in and out of the house as supposed dental patients. And Emma's making her little living there and continuing on her campaign to try to get Harvey Burdell to marry her. And this just goes on and on and on and on. A lot of fighting, another round of fighting breaks out in the fall of 1856. There's a shoving match that occurs in the stairway of 31 Bond Street. And then, early in January, Emma gets wind that Harvey is interviewing a new landlady for 31 Bond Street, Mrs. Catherine Stansbury. And Mrs. Stansbury comes by with some of her relatives to inspect the premises, and Emma's not real happy about that. So, it must be January 29th, I believe. Mrs. Stansbury shows up again with her agent, final inspection of the premises. The papers are all drawn up. A date is made for her to show up, I believe the following Monday it was, to sign the papers. It would have been February 2nd, I think. You'll never guess what happened. Sometime between 8 o'clock on January 30th and 7 a.m. on January 31st, Harvey Burdell was found dead. And Emma was instantly accused. She was arrested, held upstairs with her children incommunicado while the inquest started. And then this inquest goes on and on and on. In those days, a coroner's inquest was not the coroner's inquest that we know today. It's not about the cause of death, it's about who did it. And sure enough, after 2 weeks of coroner's inquest, with every politician in New York, every major lawyer getting involved, Emma Cunningham and her then current paramour, because she'd taken up with another boarder by that time, a tanner and a tallow dealer named John Eckel, whose picture, yes, here's John. They are both accused of having perpetrated this crime. As soon as the inquest verdict was rendered, I mean, you wouldn't have believed what happened down on Park Road. The reporters are running in and out of 31 Bond Street with their notepads, rushing downtown to transcribe everything. There are thousands of people outside 31 Bond Street every day for 2 weeks, waiting to hear the newest developments in this case. You have to remember that the reason this crime attracted so much attention and the reason the crime dominated the newspapers for 8 months, not only in New York but across the country, was this was the first time ever in urban America that a woman who had been wronged by an upper middle class or even a middle class man or a wealthy man had supposedly or allegedly taken vengeance and sought recompense. In the lower classes, men were murdered all the time, whether they deserved it or not, by their mistresses, by their wives, by their lovers, by prostitutes, by whomever. It happened routinely, even though the murder rate in New York City, at least, was not nearly as high as it has been in our times, at least until recently. Middle-class men, upper-class men did what the heck they pleased. They were sporting gentlemen. You know, I'm done with you. Go. Here's a few bucks, or not even a few bucks. Just get out of my hair. And it didn't matter. It just didn't matter. There was a very rigid social order, and that's how things were run. Emma Cunningham, who may or may not have done it, although I think she did it, and she had every reason to do it, took vengeance upon a man in a way that split the city apart across breakfast tables, in barrooms, women on this side, men on that side. I mean, the whole city was split apart and nationwide, and I don't have to tell you who was for whom there. And this is all coming really at the cusp of the emerging women's rights movement in this country. And the newspapers are filled with editorials. The establishment newspaper editors, even Horace Greeley, who was a very liberal man, had a lot of doubts about Emma Cunningham's, quote, virtue, unquote. James Gordon Bennett, certainly, and Henry Raymond. If you read the Times, if you read the Herald, if you read the Sun, she is equated with the most horrible witches and murderesses in all of history, as the district attorney did at her murder trial. The inquest verdict is issued in middle of February of 1857. Emma is sent down to the Tombs, and that's where she sits for a good long time. She retained a lawyer named Henry Loren Clinton, who I call a mixture of Clarence Darrow and Johnny Cochran, to be her defense lawyer. This guy was very smart. Emma was a very problematic defendant, and she had claimed at the inquest even to be married to Dr. Burdell, thinking that might get her off. Why would she murder her husband, who was had agreed to take care of her? And she pulled from under the bombazine folds of her dress a marriage certificate from Reverend Uriah Marvine of the Dutch Reformed Church in Amos Street, which is now, I think, 10th Street in Greenwich Village, in the West Village. And here she is married in October of 1856. She probably faked this marriage. She and John Eckel probably trotted over there together. Eckel was proved to have rented a toupee and some false whiskers so he could look like Burdell, and they went over there and got married one night. And I found this document this wasn't known. I mean, I don't know how it ended up, but it ended up in Samuel J. Tilden's legal files, which are at the New York Public Library, the Astor Lennox Tilden Foundation. One day it occurred to me to go over there and look, and here this thing is. And Tilden represented the Burdell family in the estate litigation that I hope I have time to tell you a bit about later. But here this is, and I actually went out to Rutgers, to Gardner Sage Seminary at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, and I found Reverend Marvine's marriage register sitting there down in the basement. And this is the entry, and this is Reverend Marvine's handwriting, and he charged, I think, 10 bucks, and they paid him with a banknote and got out of there. Henry Loren Clinton decided with Emma, as the murder trial was approaching, that it was very, very important to try to prove in a non-circus atmosphere, such as prevailed at the inquest, that Emma was actually married to this guy. And he went to surrogate's court while Emma was in jail, awaiting trial on the murder trial charges, to try to prove that she was entitled to Harvey Burdell's estate. She was his client. She needed that money. She was entitled to that money. He and she thought that the marriage was the best way to get her hands on that money. She'd been entitled to it. Burdell died intestate without a will, but as his spouse, she would have been entitled to, I think, half of it at the time. He had no other previous wives, children, nothing else. She would have gotten at least half of it, and his other relatives, represented by Samuel Tilden, would have gotten the other major share of the estate. This estate litigation went on its course for a month or two, but District Attorney Abraham Elegant Oakey Hall, who had been at the inquest also and now was charged with prosecuting Emma Cunningham and diffusing the storm of controversy about unsafe streets and wicked women that was all over the papers in the city, rushed the case to trial downtown, the murder case to trial. And at the start of May, he impaneled a jury, and Emma was put up there. But in 4 days, Henry Loren Clinton managed to sway everybody, and Emma was acquitted of this murder. Remarkable. You, again, cannot imagine the scene out in the street down in City Hall. The Supreme Court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, was down there in City Hall at the time. And the streets were, I don't have time to read all the description, but the streets were an absolute circus. Tens of thousands of people were down there every day of this trial. Not thousands, tens of thousands of people. And this is a city of 500,000 people, New York at the time. O.J. Simpson, just think O.J. Simpson, because this was the O.J. Simpson case of its day, absolutely, in media coverage, in gender politics, in every respect, and I can't overemphasize that. Emma's acquitted. What would you do if you were acquitted, if you barely escaped being hung by the neck in the courtyard of the Tombs? Okay, you didn't have any money, you had 5 kids to support, but you just got away with murder, probably, and you just got away with your life. Wouldn't you tuck your tail between your legs, man, woman, whatever, and kind of lay low at least for a while? Not Emma Cunningham. She rode home to 31 bond in a carriage and started planning with her attorney how to resume the surrogate's course case. They're in court, they're litigating, and they're litigating. It's the start of July, and at the closing summation in Surrogate Bradford's courtroom, Henry Loring Clinton and his associate advert. They don't come right out loud and say it, but they advert that Emma may be entitled to this estate by one of 2 ways. Either she's his wife, but Your Honor, if she's not his wife, perhaps there's an unborn child, the decedent's unborn child is being carried. Proceedings are recessed, and Surrogate Bradford takes off for the country to consider. Henry Loring Clinton goes to Sharon Springs for the rest of the summer and comes back to town early in August. August 4th, he's at his breakfast table downtown in his private home, opens the newspaper. Uh-oh. He didn't know what his client was doing. He didn't know. She's been arrested again. Why has Emma Cunningham been arrested again? Well, unbeknownst to him, and I don't know how this got into court at the very end of the surrogate's court proceeding, but unbeknownst to Henry Loring Clinton, she had been seeing her private physician, Samuel Catlin, even while she was in the Tombs, and she had started to claim that she was pregnant by Burdell right